Now I would like to invite on this place here our keynote speaker, Alfredo Saad Filo, who is a professor of political economy at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and he has worked in research institutions and universities in many different countries, among them Brazil, Canada, Mozambique, and Switzerland, and he was a senior economic affairs officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And today he will speak about neoliberalism versus social justice, policy alternatives in times of crisis. Thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
I'd like to start by thanking Thomas Klaas and Joubert Ashkar. It is a great privilege for me to be here to participate in the launch of this really excellent publication that gives a contribution not only for the debate in the Arab region, but also worldwide. What I want to do today is to look at neoliberalism and look at the policies associated with neoliberalism. And I want to finish with a little bit of speculation in terms of the policy alternatives for this new phase of neoliberalism that I'm going to define through the convergence of global economic crisis with a political crisis of democracy. Now, if we look across the social sciences, neoliberalism is normally defined as an ideology or alternatively as a set of supposedly market-friendly economic policies or social policies. I think these views are correct, but they are insufficient. And I would prefer to look at neoliberalism as the current phase or configuration or mode of existence of capitalism at this historical time. In this sense, I define neoliberalism as a system of accumulation, and it has five distinguishing features. The first one is the financialization of production and state policy and practice. The second defining feature of neoliberalism is the international integration of production at the level of individual firms and individual circuits of accumulation, which is normally conventionally called globalization. The third is the financialization of ideology and state policies. And the fourth is, in the mature phase of neoliberalism, typically a macroeconomic policy mix based on contractionary fiscal and monetary policies and inflation targeting, with the manipulation of interest rates becoming the most important policy tool. And the final defining feature of neoliberalism for me is the financialization of social reproduction. And what I want to do now is go through these features and show how they lead to the economic crisis that we're experiencing at the moment, and then the political crisis too. Now, neoliberalism is a modality of existence of capitalism where state capacity to allocate resources and to influence the composition of output, the composition of employment, the composition of consumption, the composition and levels of investment and trade, and the financing of the state, all of them were capacities that were systematically transferred from the state to a globally integrated financial sector dominated by public and private institutions based in the United States. And this has allowed the financial system to control the sources of capital and the main levers of economic policy in the majority of countries. Now, because financial institutions have become the center of the process of social reproduction and the process of economic growth and accumulation of capital under neoliberalism, those institutions have been able to appropriate an increasing share of the total value produced. For example, if you look at the United States, the profits of financial institutions grew from under 10% of total profits in the immediate post-Second World War period to 41% of total profits being captured by finance in 2007, just before the current global crisis. Profits fell, became negative immediately after the crisis, but then they bounced back again, and they are now about 35%. 35% of total profits in the United States are captured by finance. But it's not just that finance hijacked the economy for its own benefit. Neoliberalism and financialization have led to an extraordinary recovery of overall total profitability in most countries. But then, and this is a paradox of neoliberalism, despite the recovery of profitability, rates of investment and GDP growth have fallen, at least in the OECD countries. Now, all this is about the first feature of neoliberalism. And it follows that under neoliberalism, finance takes on a unique significance on its own account and through its global influence in the form of financialization. And just like the concept of neoliberalism, the concept of financialization has been understood in very different ways. But the way I understand it is as the intensification and expansion in the scope of financial activities, incorporating new areas of social reproduction. Finance and financialization take over production, but they also take over housing, they take over pensions, education, they take over health and roads. And all these activities that are essential for social reproduction, they become subordinated to the logic of finance. So financialization then plays, through its overall influence in social reproduction, financialization plays an essential role in enforcing discipline, enforcing social discipline, moving capital to countries and to activities offering higher rates of return, facilitating the restructuring of production through mergers and acquisitions, and funding the development of entirely new industries. So the point is that finance has become critical to the overall real, so-called real economy under neoliberalism, and finance has taken an entire life all of its own. And at the global level, the financialization of economies and the financialization of production, they have been associated with very large current account imbalances, and those imbalances have led to very significant dislocations, both within countries and between countries. In this sense, the global financial crisis that started in 2007 is a demonstration of the limitations of financialization as the driver of accumulation in the world as a whole. Now, moving on to my third defining feature of neoliberalism, the financialization of the state is important at three levels. The first level is that ideologically, only the state can legitimize the transfer to finance of control over the sources of capital, and only the state can legitimize the neoliberal accumulation strategies that we have mentioned just a moment ago. It is the state that drives it. Neoliberalism is not about the withdrawal of the state. At a second level, politically, the state needs to manage the legal and the regulatory changes that are needed in the transition to neoliberalism, and the state must repress the opposition too. At a third level, economically, it is the state that puts together the new industrial structure, the new financial structure. It is the state that commercializes public services. It is the state that imposes means-tested welfare provision. It is the state that withdraws social security and social protections. It is the state that drives privatizations, that imposes public-private partnerships. It is the state that introduces private sector performance indicators on the civil service and on the state institutions themselves. Now, ideologically, neoliberalism is then justified through a discourse that is based on two fundamental principles. The first principle is the principle of competitiveness, the notion that if you have more choice, you are therefore consequently necessarily happier as an individual. And this is always seen in a very short-termist sense of choice that is associated with the way financial markets operate. These are the markets that they have in mind when they talk about neoliberalism and choice. And the second ideological principle supporting neoliberalism is the idea of democracy. But it's the idea of democracy in a very narrow sense, of a very shallow form of political competition between shades of neoliberalism in a specific political market that is invigilated and monitored by a right-wing media. Now, these notions of competitiveness and of democracy, they underpin the neoliberal vision of the good society, and they inform the norms of behavior that are compatible with this system of accumulation, and that then become the common sense of our age. We all think in neoliberal terms these days, and we all think in financialized terms. Now, financialization then has influenced social reproduction enormously, and it has imposed discipline on the majority of the population, primarily, I suggest, in 4 ways. First, through the expansion of capitalism. The expansion of capitalism across Eastern Europe, across Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, and across the Arab world in the last 3 or 4 decades, and the integration of production taking place in these countries into global accumulation circuits. And this has increased competition both between and within national working classes and national societies. Second, neoliberalism has imposed discipline through technological innovations, through the restructuring of production, through changes in the patterns of employment, and through restrictions to wages, to subsidies, to benefits, to entitlement systems, to all the non-market protections that had been introduced under Keynesianism in the advanced countries, under different forms of developmentalism in the developing countries and in Soviet regimes too. Third, neoliberalism has imposed discipline, and financialization has imposed discipline through restrictive monetary and fiscal policies and through the retrenchment of the welfare state, all of them supported by easy credit. Now, you provide for yourself, the state does not provide for you. And fourth, the workers in particular, and in the United States and in the United Kingdom especially, but in other countries too, they have become increasingly tangled up into financial circuits through their bank accounts, through their credit cards, through their mortgages, through their pensions, and through their payments for education, for health, and for many other areas of social provision, especially after the rollback of the welfare state. And this is what I'm trying to capture through this notion of financialization of social reproduction. And it has contributed to higher rates of profit and simultaneously higher inequality almost everywhere. And this is the story, a key story under neoliberalism, the story of the deterioration, the worsening of the distribution of income. And recently this has hit all the headlines. Even the International Monetary Fund now agrees that there is a problem. And if we look at the neoliberal age as a whole, in most advanced economies, the top 1% of earners have seen the biggest and in some cases the only income gains in the age of neoliberalism. For 30 or 40 years, only the top 1% has earned or has won out. And this is for several reasons. It's because of capital mobility, it's because of the reduction of taxation, it's because of intensified competition, it's because of financialization, and a whole range of other reasons as well. The point is that under neoliberalism, many firms have been led to adopt inequality-generating accumulation strategies that led to the concentration of income and rising unemployment at the same time. And in these ways, neoliberalism has created unprecedentedly, extraordinarily favorable conditions for the accumulation of capital and for the concentration of power, income, and wealth around the world. And neoliberalism has led to rising living standards for the minority of the population, epitomized by the top 1% or whatever. Now, this is a picture of strength. But despite its considerable strengths, neoliberalism has also led to falling rates of investment and falling rates of GDP growth around the world, on average, with the notable exception of China, to a secondary, much more limited degree, India. But in the advanced economies, this is absolutely correct for almost every single country. Neoliberalism and financialization have also been associated with more frequent and more severe finance-driven crises that culminated in the deepest and the longest economic crisis since the Great Depression that has been going on since 2007. Economic recoveries have also tended to become more and more slow and more distributionally negative since the beginnings of neoliberalism. And it now has become the consensus, even amongst the most mainstream economists, that we have entered, the global economy has entered a great stagnation with no end in sight. Now, all of this is about the economy. And if you look at the political side, you see immediately that neoliberalism is politically quite elastic. It goes all the way from the genocidal dictatorships of Jorge Videla in Argentina and Augusto Pinochet in Chile to contemporary mainstream social democracy in several countries, to the Brazilian Workers' Party, the South African Triple Alliance, and across a whole range of authoritarian neoliberal regimes in the Arab world. But typically neoliberalism draws on a limited form of democracy that is designed to shield the economy from political debate and political intervention, and in which popular participation is limited to choosing between shades of neoliberalism in a sterilized political market where the mainstream media keeps the debate under very tight constraints. This is a neoliberal democracy. This is what it is. And it is very different from the political forms of classical democracy before the First World War, and of course very, very different from democracy under the Social Democratic Compact after the Second World War in the advanced economies. Now today, the choices about social provision, the choices about the composition of output, the structure of employment, the distribution of income, they are driven by supposedly independent institutions, especially central banks that have been captured by finance and service finance. They are determined by regulatory agencies that have been captured by the business conglomerates that are nominally under their own authority. They are determined by business associations, by international organizations, by the European Commission, by the WTO, the US Treasury Department, the US State Department. And these are systemic changes. And the systemic restructuring of production and the systemic restructuring of social reproduction under neoliberalism, they put together help to explain the implosion of left-wing political parties, trade unions, and mass organizations in the past 30 years. And across this period, the political spectrum has shifted to the right almost everywhere. And neoliberalism then itself, in doing this, has been through two phases, and I will suggest that it is now entering a third phase. The first phase of neoliberalism is a phase of transition, a phase of shock. And this initial phase, it is directed against the system of accumulation that existed before. In most countries, including in the Arab region, this transition is about the imposition of the interests of transnational capital and transnational finance by force and without regard to the consequences. And this transition requires intense state intervention to contain labor, to disorganize the left, to promote the transnational integration of capital at the level of individual circuits of accumulation, and to impose a new institutional framework. If you look at social policy, the domain of social policy, the transition phase to neoliberalism is a negative phase. It's a negative phase where there is a process of rolling back, fragmenting, and dismantling what existed before. In the advanced economies, this was done as and when political circumstances permitted, sometimes under the pretext of fiscal crises that themselves had been caused by tax cuts, so deliberate fiscal crises. In the developing countries, in most cases, there was very little by way of social policy anyway, and much of what existed was starved of funds as those systems of accumulation, those developmental systems of accumulation entered into crisis. But the worst disaster was in the transition countries, where entire structures of employment and social provision were dismantled, often very, very suddenly, leading to profound social crises and one of the worst demographic outcomes ever recorded in peacetime in the case of Russia. Now, this transition phase of neoliberalism is harsh, but it is normally followed by a second phase of mature neoliberalism that aims to stabilize the social relations that have been imposed in the first phase. that aims to consolidate the expanded role of finance in economic and social reproduction, that seeks to manage the new form of international integration of each economy, and that wants to introduce typically neoliberal social policies to limit and to manage the deprivation that has been created in the transition to neoliberalism. This is also the time when states nurture economic agents to embody a neoliberal subjectivity. That is when neoliberalism becomes common sense. And in the Arab region, your report shows very, very clearly the damage that has been caused by neoliberalism across a whole range of areas of social intercourse. And the report also shows how the damage here was uniquely severe because most Arab countries lack established traditions of democracy, of rule of law, of human rights, of gender equality, of social security and environmental protection that would themselves have limited the damage caused by neoliberalism. In this region, fiscal and monetary policies under neoliberalism have been uniquely regressive, and investment policies have been advantageous primarily to business elites and to global capital. Trade liberalization has damaged local industry and local agriculture, and it has led to higher unemployment, to chronic fiscal deficits, and to the disorganization of the economy. And these limitations, these shortcomings, these perverse outcomes, and their consequences to social justice in the region were revealed by the great Arab uprising starting here in Tunisia that brought together demands for political freedom and for economic democracy at the same time. But these demands are incompatible with the reproduction of neoliberalism. And so here and in other parts of the world, nearly a decade after the start of the global economic crisis, half a decade after the great uprisings, we have great political instability here and around the world. Today, many neoliberal democracies are engulfed in turmoil, starting in the Eurozone periphery, and then more recently, the crisis of neoliberal politics reaches the global south, where authoritarian regimes have been capturing power in different ways via more or less honest elections, via judicial parliamentary coups, via the abuse of constitutional prerogatives, or via old-style military coups. And then the political crisis reaches the core NATO countries. We had Brexit by a small majority. We had Trump, who won the election even though he lost the vote. We had Marine Le Pen in the second round in France. We have nativist populism in Austria, in Switzerland, and in Scandinavia. And if you look at the eastern periphery of the European Union, you have a whole collection of ridiculous far-right politicians leading disintegrated societies against the weakest possible enemies they could find, mostly dark-skinned refugees from the south, and so on. And what I want to suggest is that this rise of nationalist authoritarianism, particularly in the advanced economies, is not a transitory blip. What we have unfolding right now before our eyes is a consequence of the structural crises of economies, societies, and political institutions of representation under neoliberalism. And the reason I suggest is because neoliberalism has created a vast array of economic losers, especially in the advanced economies, but not only there. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide have been de-skilled and moved into precarious jobs. Tens of millions of jobs have disappeared in the last 3 or 4 decades. Entire professions have evaporated or have been exported to cheap countries. Pay and conditions for labor have worsened almost everywhere, and the condition of labor has deteriorated for the informal workers, for the traditional middle classes, and for almost everyone else. In almost any country you care to look into, you will find large social groups that used to be relatively privileged, but now complain that they are unable to provide for their children. And just as disorganized social groups are always vulnerable to political capture by the elite, I suggest that the losers under neoliberalism are vulnerable to capture by the far right. Because through the economic restructuring of their societies. They lack a sense of collectivity based on shared material circumstances. Quite rightly, they distrust the political dysfunctionality of neoliberalism, and they are led by politicians and by the media, first to blame groups at the very bottom of society for the disasters that have been inflicted by neoliberalism itself. So if you have a problem with lack of health or education or housing or jobs, if there's a crisis in provision, it's the fault of people who are poorer than we are. They're taking our jobs, they're taking our health, taking our houses. If you have problems of deindustrialization or unemployment or de-skilling, then it's the fault of countries that are even poorer than we are. We all blame China for everything, don't we? And this is destructive and it fragments people. But everyone can come together. Everyone can come together to blame political corruption for all evils. And this has become the only acceptable form of opposition within neoliberalism. And everyone can come together in support of nationalism as the only acceptable form of convergence of individual interests under advanced neoliberalism. So by blaming the poor, by blaming corruption, and by promoting nationalist values, people are invited to frame their disappointments, their hopes, their fears through a universalist ethics where there is no exploitation. There is only individual honesty or dishonesty. And this binary right now is being used to support reactionary programs framed on a common sense language and fronted by supposedly strong leaders who pretend to be talking honestly to you, who pretend to be defending the nation, who pretend to be able to get things done bypassing institutions that have been captured or rendered completely inefficient by neoliberalism itself. And the advance of these views and their transformation into a political force, especially in the advanced countries, I suggest, is the reflex of a desperate search by many millions of people, a search to short-circuit a political system that is unquestionably jammed and unresponsive, and a search for gains for people who have gone tired. They've grown tired of losing out. In the advanced economies, mainstream political parties, mainstream conservative political parties, have survived this process much better than the center-left. The center-left has largely imploded. The center-right has survived better because center-right mass parties identify themselves more easily with neoliberal ideology and policy practice, and because the right is more used to deploying misleading programs and nationalist slogans. But even those mainstream right-wing parties have been triangulating gradually towards a stronger nationalism and a more and more exclusionary set of programs, while a new generation of more or less fascist movements breathes down their necks. And this is very, very dangerous because the far right has a proven ability to mobilize on the basis of national identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, and male identity, and it thrives in conditions of social despair. My suggestion is that different forms of fascism will prosper as neoliberalism deteriorates. What we move into now is a new shock phase of neoliberalism. A new shock phase fronted by fiscal austerity, by advanced forms of financialization, backed up by social division and by collective immiseration as one group after the other is crushed. This is a renewal of shock phase neoliberalism, but from a higher base where a neoliberal subjectivity is already in place. So in the first phase of neoliberalism, collectivity was rolled back in the workplace and in society at large. And then neoliberalism reconstructed subjectivities, included the creation of a social base of support for itself. Now neoliberalism crushes the remaining bonds between citizens, leading to the destruction of citizenship itself. And potentially, this could be a terminal crisis for democracy. There is then an urgent need in the Arab region and elsewhere for left alternatives, imagining a future with redistributive, democratic, and ecologically sustainable policies. But because neoliberalism is not just an ideology, it's not just a policy choice, it has its own material basis, it is the configuration of capitalism today, then it cannot be rejected simply by voting for a different political party. The problem of moving beyond neoliberalism is the problem of alternatives, and we can't just say no to what exists. We can only say yes to a positive program, something that we can aim for rather than just something we don't like. And the structures of reproduction of poverty under neoliberalism, this comes out very, very clearly in your report. They can be addressed and transcended through the combination of faster economic growth and economic policies securing disproportionate gains to the worse off. And this is what I like to call pro-poor growth, that is supported by a whole range of economic and social reforms and by universal social policies. And this is based on 7 assumptions. And this is the final element of what I want to say today. The first assumption is that the most important problem in poor countries, and in some advanced economies too, is mass poverty. And the elimination of poverty has to be the most important priority of government. And this is not just because we want to. This is also mandated by the United Nations through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration on the Right to Development, and the SDRs. Second assumption is that rapid and sustained growth, balance of payments equilibrium, inflation control, industrial development, and all those conventional parameters of economic success, they have no value in themselves. They are only instruments for the elimination of mass poverty and for the achievement of secure, sustainable, equitable, and empowering human development. Third assumption is that macroeconomic policy tools can provide a very, very important contribution to the elimination of mass poverty. Fourth, the implementation of those policies will require confronting selectively the hegemony of neoliberalism in the economy, and it will demand the reduction, the limitation, the curtailing of the influence of financial interests on the availability and use of foreign exchange, the allocation of resources, and the solvency of the state. Fifth, those pro-poor policies must improve the living standards of the majority through investment in priority sectors, through the improvement in the distribution of income and wealth, and through sustained increases in wages, in employment, and in consumption. These outcomes must be independent of trickle-down, and they should be unambiguous across a whole spectrum of measures of welfare. There can be no doubt about the outcomes that we want to achieve. Sixth is that to maximize the impact of those policies, given the resources available, pro-poor policies need to be focused. They have to include priorities on the sectors that benefit the poor directly, the sectors that generate income and employment for the poor, the sectors that produce goods and services consumed by the poor, especially those that depend primarily on domestic inputs. That is small-scale agriculture, it's construction, it's infrastructure, it's the informal sector, it's the production of basic consumer goods. They should also seek to promote investment and technological upgrading, particularly in manufacturing in the export sector, because these will probably be the drivers of long-term growth in most countries. Final point is that pro-poor economic strategies will require the public sector to induce, to regulate, and to sustain the process of growth. The state will need to target resources into priority sectors and in areas that bring direct benefits to the poor. The state must secure macroeconomic stability, including low inflation and high levels of employment. And to achieve those goals, the government will need to deploy growth accommodating and fiscal and monetary policies. Now, these are ambitious ideas, and they can integrate struggles, they can delegitimize neoliberalism, they can support practical alternatives exactly along the lines of your report. And there is potential for them. There's potential for them in this region, there's potential for them that has been demonstrated by the success of the Sanders campaign in the US, the Corbyn movement in the UK, the Mélenchon campaign in France. We can have all sorts of criticisms to all of them. Well, we also have emerging movements in several countries that deserve criticism, that deserve praise as well. The difficulty for these movements is that those alternatives, all of them, require new structures of representation for the majority. They require political parties, they require trade unions, they require community associations, all of them corresponding not to the past, but to the current mode of existence of a society that has been extensively decomposed domestically, that has been imperfectly integrated globally, a society that has distinct cultures, but that is highly connected through internet-based tools. And we are still discovering how to do this. Today, I am more optimistic than I have been for a long time. You can sense that I've been very pessimistic for a long time. I'm more optimistic now, because the recent successes of the left in different parts of the world suggest that we may have finally found forms of organization that can work. And I think there's nothing more important now for the left, right now, than to become involved in building this, exactly this new wave of movements. I think this is precisely what we need to do. And I'll finish on this. Without wanting to be excessively dramatic, I will be a little bit dramatic. I think there is a race going on between the restoration of social and political collectivity, drawing on progressive principles, exactly the roadmap in your publication, and the other side, the side of barbarism. And the winner, literally, the winner will take it all. And this is the reason why I think you're doing an absolutely fantastic job in this report and in your preparatory work that is absolutely vital, not only for the Arab region, but for the whole world. Thank you very much.